Morning, good afternoon, wherever you're watching from today. This is our first in a series with the Crescent City Classic for the World War II Challenge and Operation Pacific Theater, a virtual challenge in which you're accumulating mileage to cross the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, symbolically using the original length of the Burma Road as our point of reference and that mileage that we accumulate. I'm here today with John Parshall, as we're going to discuss one of the first key battles, the Battle of Midway, something that I can feel other historians shooting me with lightning now, but something we can call a turning point of World War II. Our own Rob Citino might be gazing at me from his office. But to get there, like a certain movie that bears a similar title to our webinar today, we're going to rush through the first 6 months of combat and back and forth with the Japanese until we get to the Battle of Midway. And with me is Jonathan Parshall, co-author of Shattered Sword, a book that really brought in some new insight, that Japanese insight into the Battle of Midway. And John's one of our best in graphics, maps, and really explaining at all different types of levels the Battle of Midway and really the war in the Pacific in a sort of a 101 kind of sense. So John, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, we're gonna do a whirlwind tour here of not only the first 6 months of the Pacific War, but actually I'm gonna take you all the way up to July of 1944 to the point where James Scott and I will be doing a follow-up talk for you as you're sort of at the midway point of your fitness challenge. So without further ado, what we're going to look at is the lead up to the Battle of Midway. Then I'm going to do a quickie walkthrough of the battle itself. It's a highly complex engagement. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail there, but I'll give you the highlights. And then after that, I want to talk a little bit about why Midway was so important and what happens then in the Pacific War after Midway, leading up to the events in the middle of 1944. And we're going to do that all in 30 minutes. So hang on, here we go. Starting out in 1941, the basic Japanese plan of campaign for the Pacific War was a series of operations aimed towards what they called the Southern Resource Area down in Borneo, Sumatra, Java, etc. For the simple reason that that's where all the economic goodies were that were necessary to transform Japan into a self-sufficient empire. This is where all the oil, the rubber, the tin, the manganese, all of the stuff that they need is located. And so that's the direction that they're going to be heading at the beginning of this war. They're highly concerned that the American fleet may counterattack across the breadth of the Pacific from the Hawaiian Islands and hit them in the flank as they are attempting to do their business down in the south. And that is the reason for the attack against Pearl Harbor, which we as Americans, of course, tend to sort of over-focus on, but really Pearl Harbor was just one component in a much broader plan of campaign. And so what you see happening very quickly after Pearl Harbor, within the first week or so, is a series of attacks across the breadth of the Pacific. At both Wake and Guam, the Japanese attack our bastions there. They land troops in 2 different locations in the Philippines, begin advancing against Manila. They also land troops on the Malayan Peninsula and begin working their way down towards the British bastion of Singapore. Hong Kong is also attacked and is going to fall on Christmas Day. And so that brings us then to 1942, the first 6 months of which are just absolutely ruinous for the Allies in the Pacific. So that first series of operations that the Japanese initiate are so successful that they speed up their operational timetable. And what you see happening in fairly short order then is Manila in the Philippines falls around the beginning of the year. And Singapore likewise is captured in February 15th of 1942, one of the most cataclysmic defeats in British military history. Very quickly thereafter, there's a series of naval battles towards the end of February, which exterminate Allied naval power in that region then followed up with land invasions of Sumatra and Java, which capture the southern resource area. The Japanese also capture the port of Rabaul here in New Britain, which is going to be the linchpin of their defense system in the Southwest Pacific. They launch a very powerful carrier raid against Northern Australia at Darwin. And then they also advance into the Bay of Bengal in April with a very powerful carrier raid that just raises havoc for the British position in that neck of the woods. So by the time you get to, April of 1942, it's just been an absolutely terrible run for the Allies. The Japanese have been victorious everywhere they've gone. And in the process, a great deal of American and British naval hardware has gone down into the drink. That brings us to about May of 42. The Japanese have now carved out for themselves one of the largest empires in the history of man. And it is only now that they suffer the first check to their advance during the Battle of Coral Sea in early May of 1942, which prevents them from capturing Port Moresby on the tip of New Guinea down here. So that brings us to the beginnings of the Battle of Midway. It's in about the middle of May that the Americans begin picking up indications that the Japanese may be aiming an offensive at the island of Midway itself. And it really comes down to a contest between these two men, Isoroku Yamamoto, who's commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, and his counterpart, Chester Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto's problem that he's trying to get a grasp on is, how do I bring this war to a conclusion? And the only way that he can conceive of making that happen is to get the Americans to the bargaining table somehow. And he feels that the best way to make that happen is to seek out our remaining aircraft carriers and destroy them. And hopefully that'll be enough of a shock to the American psyche that we'll be able to get to a negotiated settlement with the Americans somehow. He is involved in a power struggle with his boss, Admiral Nagano, who's the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy. Nagano and the Japanese Army both want to go into the Southwest Pacific and cut off the supply lines to Australia. Yamamoto does not. He wants to go into the Central Pacific because he argues that that is closer to the main American carrier base at Oahu. And there's a number of political shenanigans that end up happening. Yamamoto wins that battle and he's given the go-ahead to do his operation. The place that he selects for his attack is these two tiny postage stamp sized atolls out in the middle of the Pacific, Midway Atoll. The reason he wants to go there is because it's at the very tip of the Hawaiian Islands, and he thinks that if he can get a foothold in the Hawaiian Island chain, move down that chain, and maybe eventually take Oahu, that too would be a very important bargaining card to have when the negotiated settlement hopefully happens. So Midway is where he's going to go for this attack. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, you've got Chester Nimitz and the problems that he's grappling with. How do I turn around this train wreck of a war, which has gone just terribly for us to this point? And in particular, how do I meet the Japanese carrier force, which at this point has been pretty much invincible every place it's gone? How do I meet them on something like an equal footing? Because the real problem for the Americans is that at the beginning of the Pacific War, the Japanese have a tremendous advantage in terms of numbers of carrier flight decks in the Pacific. So if you look at the beginning of the war, the Americans have only got 4 big flight decks. The Japanese have 6, and they also have another 5 escort carriers along as well. So the Americans are not in a position to do a counteroffensive because they are heavily outnumbered in terms of carriers. By the time we get to the actual eve of Midway itself, the situation looks like this. Lexington has been sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea. Saratoga is in the yards because she collected a torpedo hit from a submarine back in January. That leaves the Americans a trio of Yorktown class carriers, and the Wasp is in the process of moving over from the Atlantic, but she ain't here yet. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side of the docket, Shokaku was badly damaged during Coral Sea. Zuikaku, her sister, had her air group shot to pieces, and they lost the light carrier Shoho. So the Japanese at this point still have a fairly substantial advantage in terms of carriers. The big thing that the Americans and Nimitz have going for them is we've broken Japan's operational naval codes, and we're reading enough of their traffic that gives Nimitz bare time to scrape together the assets that he needs and put them up around Midway to be able to offer battle to the Japanese. And his battle plan, roughly speaking, looks like this. Intel is telling us that the Japanese are going to come in from the northwest of the island. So he figures that what he'll do is flood the immediate area with American submarines, as many as he can scrape up. He's going to beef up the air power on Midway itself. And hopefully these two groups of assets, submarines and land-based air power, will whittle down the Japanese carrier force. That then if he positions his own carriers in an ambush position off to the northeast, he'll be able to hit the Japanese when they're vulnerable and, you know, be able to win the battle in a stroke pretty much. There's been a lot of comment down through the years around the odds around this particular battle. And if you look at books like Incredible Victory or A Miracle at Midway, they portray it in roughly those terms, that the Americans were so heavily outnumbered that it took an act of God for us to actually be able to win this battle. And it's true if you look at the number of Japanese warships that are running around in the Pacific doing something on the morning of 4 June 1942, the Americans are heavily outnumbered by the Japanese Navy. But when you start subtracting out all of the forces that are going up to places like the Aleutian Islands, the various invasion support forces, the oilers, the attack transports, Yamamoto's main body that's trailing 500 miles behind, when you get down to the tip of the spear, the forces that actually came into contact with each other on the morning of 4 June, it's these guys. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, about 250 aircraft and supporting warships. The Americans have got 3 aircraft carriers, an unsinkable island airfield, and about 360 aircraft along with their supporting warships. So really, this is one of the reasons that the battle is so closely fought during this morning, is because the forces at the tip of the spear really are fairly evenly matched. So now I'd like to walk you through the Cliff Notes version of what actually happens on that day. American intelligence is absolutely right on the money. The Japanese show up pretty much on time and on schedule. 0430 on the morning of 4 June, they are within 250 miles of Midway, and they put up a very powerful strike of 108 aircraft and go off to attack the island. They are completely unaware, of course, that there are any American carriers anywhere in the neighborhood. That leads to a morning attack at 0700, where the Japanese come in and basically wipe out the Marine fighter units over the island and bomb Midway relatively heavily. But they don't put it out of business, and there's going to be a need for a second Japanese strike against Midway. At the same time, Midway's air power, the first of that, is beginning to show up and is attacking the Japanese carrier force. And so at the very same time that Midway is being bombed, the Japanese carriers are being attacked by planes from Midway, who quickly discover that Japan's combat air patrol and that their Zero fighter is extremely formidable. And so these attacks are ruined. They inflict no damage, and the Americans suffered very heavy casualties as a result. These are followed up by additional American attacks beginning at about 0800, including a group of B-17s, which take a number of spectacular shots of Japanese aircraft carriers pirouetting underneath them as sticks of 500-pound bombs land in the sea on either side. This is Hiryu turning for her life. But none of these attacks are effective as well. And so the Japanese at this point are completely unscathed. However, the Americans by this time have detected the Japanese carrier force, and our own carriers have launched against them. And so beginning at about 0920 in the morning, you have the first in a series of very famous torpedo squadron attacks, most famously by VT-8 from Hornet, which is annihilated. 15 planes in, 15 planes shot down, only one guy left alive in the water, and completely unsuccessful in terms of inflicting damage on the Japanese. Followed up by another attack by VT-6, similarly unsuccessful. And then at 10:20, completely by luck, two different formations of American warplanes have picked up the Japanese carrier forces and are approaching from two different threat vectors. So you have the torpedo squadron and dive bomber squadron, VB3 and VT3 from the Yorktown, coming in roughly from the east-southeast. And then Enterprise's two squadrons of dive bombers coming in from the southwest. And it's against this sort of multi-axial, multi-altitude attack that Japan's combat air patrol just falls apart. And the result is, beginning at 10:22, the most famous dive bomber attack in history, where the Americans attack three Japanese aircraft carriers, and in the course of about 7 minutes, knock out all three of them, Soryu, Kaga, and Akagi, leaving just Hiryu to counterattack against the Americans. She does so beginning at about lunchtime. Her dive bomber squadron inflicts pretty heavy damage against the Yorktown, knocks her dead in the water for a while. The Americans are able to patch her up and get her back up to speed just in time for her to be attacked again at about 2 in the afternoon by Hiryu's torpedo plane squadron. And this attack is decisive and leaves Yorktown drifting and listing and shortly to be abandoned. And she is out of the fight. However, later on in the afternoon, the Americans now detect Hiryu and send their remaining dive bombers after her and knock her out of business at about 5 p.m. In the afternoon. And this effectively decides the battle in the Americans' favor. All 4 Japanese carriers now have been wrecked and will be sinking either shortly thereafter or early tomorrow morning. So if you look at the final tally from the battle itself, the Japanese lose 4 aircraft carriers and also a heavy cruiser. The Americans lose the carrier Yorktown is sunk a couple days later by a Japanese submarine, which also sinks the destroyer Hammond with very heavy loss of life as well. But, you know, the Americans have now, you know, really turned things around, because if you take a look at sort of the importance in the grand scheme of things, it really comes down to, again, what is that balance of carrier forces in the Pacific? This is what the picture looks like after the Battle of Midway. The Japanese have just lost 4 aircraft carriers in an afternoon. That is tantamount to a national catastrophe. And what this does is, with the arrival of WASP shortly thereafter, the Americans have now sort of clawed their way back to parity of forces in the Pacific in terms of naval aviation. In the dark days of 1942, you know, this is a gift beyond price. This is amazing as far as the Americans are concerned. And Admiral Nimitz's boss, Ernest J. King, who is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy, immediately understands the implications here, and he is determined to use this window of opportunity to seize the initiative away from the Japanese, grab it for the Americans, and go over to the counteroffensive. This is incredibly bold on the part of King, but he's a very aggressive man and a very astute strategist as well. And so that is his plan almost as soon as the battle is ended. So if we don't want to step back here and think big picture for just a little bit, I think any discussion of strategy in World War II, and certainly in the Pacific War, has to be predicated on this graph, which shows the GDPs of the major combatant nations during World War II. And if you take a look at the US versus Japan, what you see is that the US is going to come into this fight with an economy that is roughly 5 times larger than Japan's. This is going to end World War II with an economy that's about 8 or 9 times as large. And if you look at any other indice of war production that you care to name, you know, population, coal production, steel production, energy production, anything, even automobile production, we have got it all over Japan. There's absolutely no question that in the long term, the US is going to be massively stronger than the Japanese are in terms of war-making potential. The problem is that in the short term, we're not in day-to-day contact with the Japanese, and we can't just whip out our checkbooks and say, you know, hey, we got more money, so we win this war, right? That's not how the game is played. We have to fight, and we have to be able to prove to the Japanese that we can fight better and fight well enough that we can actually take the offensive against them. The other issue, again, is that the war has actually been pretty episodic for us up to this point. That was great for the first 6 months when we were relatively disorganized and unprepared to fight the Japanese. But now it's a problem because the productive spigots are beginning to turn on in US factories, and we got more stuff coming into this theater. The bottom line is that even though Japan is weaker than we are, they are still a modern industrialized nation state. And the only way to win a war against that sort of an opponent is to apply massive levels of attrition against their military, grind it to pieces, and then eventually we are going to establish our military somewhere proximate to the home islands and either bomb it into oblivion or invade the place. That's how this war has got to end. And so what we need now is to be in contact with the Japanese, and we're not. Ground combat in the Philippines is done. We've done some carrier raids. There have been a couple of carrier battles, but there's no point in the Pacific now where we're in day-to-day contact. And we need to move to an attritional mode of warfare. I think of it in terms of a sausage grinder, right? Every morning, I want to roll out of bed knowing that it's going to be a great day today because we are going to be killing Japanese soldiers. We are going to be shooting down their aircraft, hopefully getting into a naval battle and, you know, doing what we need to do to tear their military apart. And so if you look at FDR's to-do list for 1942, it's really very simple. You know, I just need to get the Japanese in the headlock someplace, and it doesn't even really matter where, and just start giving them the business. And lo and behold, the Japanese give us the opportunity to set up not one, but 2 different sausage grinders in the space of just a couple of months immediately after Midway. The first is going to be down in New Guinea, where the Japanese land a detachment that begins moving across the Owen Stanley Mountains to try to take Port Moresby from the land. And you can kind of think of this as the Battle of Coral Sea, Part 2, being conducted via land. And that's going to suck the Australians in. It's going to bring in some American divisions under MacArthur as well. And that's going to kick off a campaign that's going to go for the rest of the year. And then likewise, the Americans counterattack at the heretofore unknown island of Guadalcanal in early August of 1942. And so that is going to kick off another campaign as well. So let's take a quick look at both of those. In New Guinea, what you see again is an advance across the incredibly rugged Owen Stanley Mountains towards Port Moresby that is repulsed in about the September of 42 timeframe. And the Americans and Australians then push the Japanese back to Bunagona, and that's where they're going to be for the rest of the year. They also repulse a Japanese invasion attempt at the tip of New Guinea at Milne Bay. Meanwhile, in Guadalcanal, we have 3 major land battles that are going to occur there over the next few months. There's going to be, as you see, 6 major naval battles, 7 actually, some of which are absolutely savage night fighting on the surface. And there's also a constant drumbeat of air combat as the Japanese are flying aircraft from Rabaul down the slot and trying to bomb Henderson Field and put it out of business. This is exactly what the doctor ordered. This is the sausage grinder. Because in the course of this campaign, we are going to kill tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. We're going to shoot down hundreds of their airplanes. The Japanese will lose about 24 major warships in the course of this campaign. This is exactly what the US needs to start grinding the Japanese military to pieces. And that brings us to 1943. Now that we've got these 2 campaigns going in the Southwest Pacific, this is where the emphasis on the war is going to stay for the remainder of this year. And so what you see happening in the New Guinea campaign is a series of operations by MacArthur's troops, which first isolate the Huon Peninsula here and capture a number of localities around there. And then towards the end of the year, the Americans are actually going to invade the tip of New Britain and put troops on New Britain as well. The goal of this entire exercise is to isolate Rabaul, which is Japan's major base in the region, get Rabaul within land-based range, start beating it up, and eventually we're thinking we may invade the place, although we never do. The same thing is happening in the Solomon Islands, where the Americans are moving up the Solomon Island chain step by step, capture an island, get an airfield, extend your air-based or land-based air umbrella another notch up the slot and keep going. The ultimate goal being to isolate Rabaul and put it under direct air attack. So this results in a series of naval battles up the slot where the Americans are now finally getting a handle on how to do night fighting and actually beat the Japanese at their own game, and a number of pretty expensive land campaigns for the Japanese as well. Finally, at the end of 1943, in August, there's a couple of invasions up in the Aleutian Islands that recapture a couple of the islands up there that the Japanese had taken around Midway. And that's followed up in November by the first of a series of amphibious operations against the Gilbert Islands, famously at Tarawa, which succeeds in capturing the place, but it's very, very bloody. And illustrates just how difficult this mode of amphibious warfare against heavily defended Japanese locales is going to be. And that brings us to 1944. The problem for the Americans is that if you look at where, you know, the front lines were in June of 1942 and now where they are in January of 1944, a full year and a half later, you know, we've taken a nibble out of the Gilbert Islands. We've moved a couple hundred miles up the Solomon Islands chain. But there are a lot of people back in DC that are like, you know, at this rate of advance, gentlemen, we're not going to be in Tokyo before about 1963. And that is not going to get it done, obviously. But what's happening behind the scenes is that the correlation of power in the Pacific is changing dramatically. It's not necessarily apparent yet, but what's happened is the American carrier force is now massively stronger than it was. The fruits of that naval building program are beginning to come off the ways. They are heavily armed with massive numbers of anti-aircraft weapons. We have new second generation fighters like the Hellcat and the Corsair, which are much superior to the Zero. And most importantly, we have built the whole logistical support network to be able to keep these large naval forces and amphibious invasion forces in supply in this huge theater. So the Americans are actually sort of poised to blow the doors off of this thing. And that's exactly what they're going to do here at the beginning of 1944. What you see happening in 1944 is the beginning of a twin axial advance across the Pacific. So we've got MacArthur moving his forces across the northern shore of New Guinea, aiming themselves towards the Philippine Islands. And then the American Navy is going directly across the Central Pacific, aiming themselves directly at the Japanese home islands. And this has the effect of keeping the Japanese constantly off balance. They never know where they're going to get hit next. And it makes it just absolutely terrible for them from a planning standpoint. They never know where the next blow is going to land. So beginning of 1944 in January, the Americans make further incursions into the Gilberts and also capture Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands. And there's another invasion on the northern shore of New Britain, or New Guinea, excuse me. February, we capture Eniwetok, and we also launch a powerful carrier raid against the heretofore unassailable bastion at Truk that annihilates it as a naval anchorage for the Japanese. You get to April, we have another couple of operations on the northern shore of New Guinea, and there's also very heavy fighting going on in China at this time as well. And that brings us to May, where MacArthur's forces capture the island of Biak at the the western tip of New Guinea. And this wrong-foots the Japanese. They think that, okay, the next blow is going to be aimed towards the Philippine Islands. We're going to move our naval units down into this neck of the woods, only to then be surprised when we get to the middle of June to get frantic messages from Saipan that there is an enormous invasion fleet sitting off of our shores. So that leads to the invasion of Saipan itself, and shortly thereafter, the Battle of Philippine Sea, which is going to be absolutely ruinous for the Japanese. And we're going to talk about those the next time we meet in July. In July of 44, the month after, the Americans launch follow-up operations at both Tinian and Guam, which are equally successful in capturing those islands from the Japanese as well. This is the first time in history that an amphibious operation has been undertaken for the sole purpose of establishing air power on a land objective. And it's all about this aircraft, the B-29 Super Fortress, which we intend to use to initiate a bombing campaign against the Japanese home island. And so the reason we're taking Guam and Saipan and Tinian is to turn them into enormous airfields. This is the island of Tinian, showing both of her airfields. The one in the front there is Northfield, which is going to become the largest operating airfield in the world when it comes online. So that takes us to July of 1944, and we will pick this back up in another month or so, and hopefully folks will have accumulated their necessary mileage by then. I look forward to seeing you in July, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has got at this point.
And John, we have a ton of questions actually, so
Cool.
We'll keep you busy for the next 20, 30 minutes or so.
Sounds great.
I'm going to start with, there was a question about the torpedoes, perhaps from the torpedo bombers, but also there's questions about the torpedoes on the submarines and the effectiveness, and did the pilots know how effective or ineffective the torpedoes could be?
Yeah, American torpedoes, all of our torpedoes, sub-launched, destroyer-launched, and air-launched at the first part of the war were not things of beauty. The submarines, of course, were infamous for having torpedoes that wouldn't explode when they hit the side of a ship, or would run too deep, or would go wild. The fundamental issue there was budgetary problems, and also an obsession with secrecy that led to a lack of real world testing of those weapons under combat conditions or near combat conditions that would have exposed some of their flaws. The American aviators certainly knew that their airdrop torpedo was a pretty delicate beast, and that they had to fly low and slow in order to actually put that fish into the water and have it survive actually landing in the drink. They didn't know that it had problems with depth keeping and also with wander. So, you know, their suspicions were were not as bad as they should have been. The American submariners at this point had no idea that the torpedoes were as bad as they were, although they're starting to get inklings by the time we get to Midway. There's actually a passage from one of the American intelligence documents that shows that the submariners are now getting a clue that, hey, our exploders don't seem to be exploding, which is a problem. But yeah, it's a real scandal, and the Bureau of Ordnance for the Navy really dropped the ball on our torpedoes.
We have two questions here kind of together. Basically, how important to the battle was Yorktown? And if the Yorktown had not made it, would there have been any difference in the outcome?
So funny you should ask the question about the Yorktown. I'm actually working on a new article, even as we speak, talking about how Admiral Nimitz evaluated the odds for this upcoming operation. It's not known widely, but Nimitz was actually prepared to accept battle not only at odds of 4 Japanese carriers to 3 American, he was prepared to accept those odds even if the Zuikaku would come along, so 5 carriers to 3. He was even willing to accept odds of 5 against 2 if Yorktown could not have been patched up, which is pretty aggressive, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in this new article. I hope to get that submitted fairly soon. One of the things I take a look at there, even though I hate counterfactual history, I'm actually sort of delving into that because there's a pair of Spanish economists who built a stochastic model of Midway, looking at some of these counterfactuals. And to your question about how important was Yorktown, Yorktown was incredibly important to the outcome of this battle. It particularly given the fact that Hornet during the battle did not perform very well at all. There's an occasion during 4 June during the battle itself where Hornet's air group goes off on a wild goose chase, the flight to nowhere it's called, and none of Hornet's aircraft except for Torpedo Squadron 8 actually came into contact with the Japanese during that crucial morning period. So if you start talking about counterfactual scenarios where, you know, Hornet maybe doesn't perform well again and Yorktown is not there, bad news for the Americans.
On that, you mentioned that lost flight from the Hornet. We actually had a question on that. Was that an error that was covered up, or has it just been forgotten?
Craig Simons, I'll tell you, he covers the flight to nowhere in his Midway book, and he's actually in the process of just writing a new biography of Nimitz that goes into even more detail about that particular episode. I don't want to call it a cover-up, but it's pretty clear that both Spruance and Nimitz come to the conclusion that Admiral Mitcher's report, he was a captain at the time, he was the commander of the Hornet. His report after the battle, Spruance thinks smells funny, and it does. And Nimitz likewise is aware of this as well, but you got to think about the implications here. If we start really pulling open this can of worms, right? One of the things we're going to have to start looking at is the fact that, okay, the only squadron from Hornet that came into contact with the Japanese that morning was VT-8 under Waldron, John Waldron. The only reason that John Waldron found the Japanese is because he was directly insubordinate and told his air group commander in the air, I'm not going to follow you. You're going the wrong direction. I'm out. And he took his squadron off and went looking for the Japanese himself. So you've got a bunch of dead American war heroes. Are you now going to, you know, have to point out that, by the way, Waldron was insubordinate? He probably would have been court-martialed if he had lived through that. It's just, nobody wants to touch that. And Nimitz likewise looks at this whole situation and does not want to be in a position where he has to air the Navy's dirty laundry after a seminal victory. You know, do I really want to bring this out to the American press? So nobody wants to go there. And what ends up happening is Mitcher has already had his ticket punched to Admiral, but they kind of put him in the doghouse for the next 15 months or so. They have him running a patrol plane squadron. So yeah, anyway, that's sort of the Cliff Notes version of that. It's a messy situation.
You mentioned Craig Simons, and you know, in his next book, I think you said chapter 10, there's a great drink recipe that Nimitz would serve to visitors in Pearl Harbor, which goes into the next question. What books would you recommend about U.S. Navy power in World War II? And Craig Simons jumps to my head right away.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long list of titles, and it really depends on what you want to get into. I like Simons' work a lot. Jim Hornfisher, the recently departed James Hornfisher's works, you know, Neptune's Inferno, Fleet at Flood Tide are excellent. Ian Toll has a very good trio of books on the American Navy and the war. And then if you want to get into some of the more detailed accounts, if you want to take a look at Fletcher, and I know we had a question about why doesn't Frank Jack Fletcher get his credit for the Battle of Midway? There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them have to do, frankly, he was sort of slandered a little later on in the war. But if you want a first-rate piece of historical work, John Lundstrom's Black Shoe Carrier Admiral is absolutely wonderful and has done a lot to rehabilitate Fletcher's reputation in the naval historical community. Lundstrom also has a couple of wonderful books on fighter combat at the beginning part of the war, 2 volumes entitled The First Team, both at Midway and then The First Team at Guadalcanal. Great stuff. Finally, too, I would say, in terms of other favorite Pacific histories, Rich Frank's book on Guadalcanal, you can't go wrong. His book on the dropping of the atomic bombs, Downfall, is excellent. His most recent work, Tower of Skulls, absolutely first rate. I would also say that the recently departed H.P. Wilmot wrote 2 wonderful volumes on the beginning of the Pacific War, Empires in the Balance and The Barrier and the Javelin, which go up to the Battle of Midway. And they stand up very, very well, even after, 25 years or so. So there's some books for you.
This is kind of getting to a big picture question here, and then we have some follow-ups on some of the various land campaigns you mentioned.
Yeah.
Competition over leadership and resources between MacArthur and the Navy, and Roosevelt brokering meetings. And so Ted McKinney's asking your perspective on how it was determined who would be on point, where, and who got resources.
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. You know, who figures out who gets what in the Pacific? Because you have to remember that, you know, in the backdrop, we have this notion of Germany first. That is our professed national strategy. And so hypothetically, it's the European theater of operations that's going to be getting the lion's share of the resources during this war effort as a whole. And in fact, you have the British getting extremely upset and noticing that the Pacific theater, if you actually look at the number of American troops that are moved overseas during 1942, at least for the first 9 or 10 months of that conflict, more of them go to the Pacific than go to the ETO and North Africa. So anyway, so now you've got a situation then in the Pacific where you've got MacArthur and you've got King squabbling over, okay, we're already getting less resources. Who's going to get the lion's share of those less resources? And MacArthur, being MacArthur, makes, you know, these dramatic, grandiose arguments that, you know, it's the Southwest Pacific that is the decisive theater for the war. Meanwhile, you've got King saying, well, you know what? This is a naval theater. You can't do anything here without warships and without naval supply. And I'm sorry, but we're not, you know, we're not giving up overall leadership in this Pacific in this theater. So what ends up happening is they end up carving the Pacific in half, and they give MacArthur the sort of the southern half, and Nimitz and the Navy get kind of the central portion. And there's a little squabbling over who's actually in command at Guadalcanal as well. Overall, big picture, I kind of feel like we were relatively effective in doling out those resources, and that we were able to build up both of those axes of advance in New Guinea and in the Central Pacific and make them viable. There's no question that MacArthur really had to scramble, particularly with his Air Force. He had to be content to do a lot of homegrown improvisation and use assets that weren't liked in the ETO. That's why you see so many P-38s flying around in the Pacific. They didn't want them as much over in the European theater. And they're doing things like, you know, taking B-25 bombers and turning them into strafers in these, you know, in these workshops in Australia. So there's a lot of improvisation going on there. But I don't really feel that either MacArthur or Nimitz has reason to say that the other guy got more than he ought to have. I kind of feel like in the end, by the time you get to 1944, that allocation of resources was roughly where it needed to be.
And now going to the Battle of Guadalcanal, which you'll be taking us to next August on our first land tour there. It also goes to Brisbane, Australia. You have a chance to sit in MacArthur's office in Brisbane. Yeah. And look toward the door that led to public relations, just the way he would have.
Right.
We have a question from Michael Thornton. Could you outline the U.S. Army's participation in Guadalcanal?
Sure. The Army was not there for the initial few months. It's the 1st Marine Division that does that campaign for the time period during the really critical land battles. But by the time you get to about October-ish, the Marines are already really, really worn out. Guadalcanal is a terrible place to have to fight any sort of a land campaign. It's, you know, I hate to say it, but it's a malarial hellhole, and the climate is absolutely awful. And our logistics situation was terrible for the first months of that campaign as well. And so what you see happening is eventually regiments of Army troops are being fed into the island, and they're going to take over for the Marines after Vandegrift leaves that theater in about the November timeframe, late November, turns it over to General Patch, and it's going to be Army troops that are going to be in charge of the later land battles, such as the campaign at the Gifu, which we're going to go visit when we go to Guadalcanal, and the final offensive that pushes the Japanese down to the western tip of the island, where they're finally evacuated. So, you know, there's no question that the American Army is learning some tough lessons on jungle combat during this time. And they're going to learn, unfortunately, even more of them in the subsequent campaigns up the Solomons at places like New Georgia, which is a terrible battle. But, you know, by the time you get to the end of 1943, a number of the Army divisions at this point are equally experienced in jungle combat as the Marines are.
And there's a question by Scott Matson, sort of coming off of what you just ended with. At what time in the Pacific campaign does this fanatic, never surrender nature of the Japanese impact America's operational planning?
Boy, that's a really good question. And honestly, that sort of goes to even questions of war termination too. When it comes to the Americans kind of starting to get their head around, you know, how the Japanese fight on the ground, I really think that starts at the very beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign during the Battle of the Tenarue, Alligator Creek, which I think is arguably the most important small unit engagement of the entire Pacific War. Eric Bergerud made that point in one of his books as well. I'm just parroting that. This is a fight within the first 4 days of the landing on Guadalcanal. It's a battalion-sized action. You got a battalion of Marines on one side of a river. You got a battalion-sized group under a guy named Ichiki come to try to capture the airfield, and they go at it on, you know, one of the evenings. And it really is an eye-opener for both sides. It's an eye-opener for the Japanese in that they become first acquainted with what it means to go up against American firepower. The Americans have got some 37 millimeter anti-tank guns that are firing canister shot, basically gigantic shotguns. And they've also got Marine 75s, which have got that creek absolutely zeroed in, and they just massacre the Japanese. It's a real eye-opener for the Americans, though, in that when they go into the coconut grove across that stream the following morning and are wiping out the remnants there and also trying to render medical aid to the wounded Japanese, a number of American medics are killed by Japanese who refuse to surrender and will lure them in and then, you know, blow them up with a grenade as it looks like they're about to give these guys first aid. That proves a real watershed. I mean, and it doesn't take the Marines very long to make that transition. It took about 30 minutes, you know. Okay, if this is how you want to play the game, this is how we're going to play the game. No quarter asked or given. You called it. That's how we'll play it, guys. And that's how it goes for the rest of the war. That has real dire implications, particularly when you start getting into 1944, because it means that we now realize that if I'm going to capture a place like Saipan, or I'm going to capture a place like Peleliu, I've got to kill 95 to 97% of the Japanese troops on that island. Kill them, not just wound them, before I'm actually going to be able to take that place and call it my own. That in turn leads to a massive reliance on firepower on the American end of things, because we don't want to take any more casualties than we have to. But yeah, it's a real eye-opener for the Americans.
And I guess on the other side of that question, we have one from Stephen Johnson. What was the reaction of the Japanese government and their upper echelon military to the defeat at Midway? And I guess you could keep going into Guadalcanal as well.
Yeah. And by the way, I'd just like to say these are really interesting, good questions. It's great to have this kind of stuff. The Japanese reaction at Midway, I think, is sort of the beginning of the slippery slope as they slide into a deliberate campaign of lies and misinformation about what actually is going on in this war. And it starts at the very top. When the Navy finally sheepishly sort of comes to the emperor and tells him, sorry, we lost 4 carriers in an afternoon, the emperor does not want the negative reaction to his people's morale to happen as a result of full transparency. And so he instead says, okay, well, we're going to issue an imperial rescript, which is, you know, practically a holy document saying Midway was a great victory. And then on the side, a couple, you know, weeks later, we're going to admit that, well, you know, Kaga was kind of sunk here and there was heavy damage to another carrier. Meanwhile, all of the survivors from Midway, the unwounded survivors, are all shipped off to various naval commands down in the South Pacific, where most of them will end up being killed. The wounded survivors are moved into specially isolated hospitals in the home islands, where they are not allowed to receive any visitors or not to talk to any reporters or anything. And when they recover, a lot of them too are going to be shipped off to the South. So there's a real inability on the part of the Japanese high command, I think, to kind of get their heads around, we've just been defeated. How do we manage that from a PR standpoint? And it just gets worse and worse the longer the war goes on. Defeat after defeat after defeat that are trumpeted as victory after victory after victory. And yet, in the long run, of course, the Japanese public becomes aware of the fact that, you know, for all of these victories, the perimeter, particularly in 1944, is constricting dramatically.
A few more questions I'm looking at here. I guess we'd go back to the sort of alternate history. What if the Japanese had concentrated more on the Southwest Pacific instead of Midway, if they had focused more south?
Good question. Rich Frank has a wonderful turn of phrase when he talks about any Japanese attempt at cutting off the supply lines for Australia is like stepping on the Allied sciatic nerve. And I think that's an absolutely apt metaphor, that anytime there was a threat to those supply lines, we reacted vigorously to it. If the Japanese had actually decided to concentrate on the Southwest Pacific, I think you would have seen a major carrier battle down there sooner rather than later. It's not widely known, but after the Doolittle raid in mid-April, we were hustling Hornet and Enterprise down to the same neck of the woods where Lexington and Yorktown were hanging out, hoping to get them down there in time for the Battle of Coral Sea. And you could make a counterfactual scenario. What if we hadn't done the Doolittle raid? We could very well have had 4 aircraft carriers down there and ambushed their 2, Zuikaku and Shokaku, and knocked them out of the war immediately. So if the Japanese had concentrated on that axis, I'm absolutely certain that we were full willing to, you know, fight a major campaign down there in defense of those supply lines.
And 2 questions that just popped in, basically the same. Yamamoto's death and that's impact on the Japanese Navy going forward.
Yeah, so Yamamoto was killed in the middle of 1943. I honestly, at that point in the war, I don't see that as being that important. The attritional ship has sailed, in that by now the correlation of forces in the Pacific is such that even if you grant that Yamamoto was a brilliant leader, which I have some misgivings about, I don't see him being able to do anything meaningful to really turn around the campaigns that are ongoing there. One of the things I often think about is that we Americans tend to over-focus on the Guadalcanal campaign because that's where our boys were. And the Australians often over-focus on Kokoda and the New Guinea campaign because that's where their boys were. The Japanese had a more accurate evaluation. They viewed those two campaigns as being sort of the twin heads of this monster that is just tearing them apart, and that they just can't keep up with the attrition on either one. So by the time you get to the middle of 1943, they're already being, you know, pushed into the meat grinder, and their air group strength in particular has been so whittled down that, you know, Yamamoto's death one way or another, I don't see it as that big a deal.
And just probably our last question here, and maybe a little bit of a softball or a controversial one, your take on the film.
My take on the movie Midway. So true confession here, I was hired as a consultant for that movie, and they hired me pretty late in the process. And you would think that if you've hired, you know, the guy who wrote the book on Midway, or at least one of a trio of guys, I guess I would say, that you would have that individual maybe checking over your script to see if there are any plot errors. They didn't have me doing anything of the kind. I was tasked with finding line drawings of the admiral's launches and opining on, you know, the interior paint colors of Japanese warships, which was sort of too bad, I guess. Insofar as the movie brought out interest in the battle, which it did, and my royalty statement supports that supposition, you know, that's great if it got people reading books on the battle. There were so many glaring problems in that movie that if you had a drinking game, you know, I'm going to take a shot every time there's a problem, you know, you'd be in the ER before you were, you know, even to the Battle of Coral Sea. It was a little, a number of the scenes were way too Star Wars-esque, you know, flying into these canyons of Ack coming up at you and so forth. I don't know. It was, I'll say this, it was a lot better than the 1976 version of the film, which even I, as a 14-year-old, looked at and was just like, you gotta be kidding me. This is, this is hokey. So not as good as it could have been. I will actually give Woody Harrelson his due for actually playing a pretty credible Nimitz. But the way they portrayed Dick Best was completely out of character for the guy. They sort of portrayed him as this, you know, gum-chewing Jersey cowboy rebel, you know, and that's totally not who Dick Best was. He was a button-down, consummate professional. But, you know, I've been involved with enough TV shows to know that when you're an historian brought in for these sorts of things, you're just playing damage control. You're trying to keep as much, you know, authenticity in there as you can. But at the end of the day, the producer is gonna have his vision of what that plot line is supposed to look like, and you're not going to affect that. So.
All right, well, John, thank you. This was fantastic. A great introduction to the war in the Pacific, the turning point, if we want to call it that, of the Battle of Midway. We'll be continuing these throughout the summer World War II Challenge. Coming up in July, we'll have James Scott join us with John Parshall as we get into the Marianas campaign. James Scott's next book will be about the B-29 flights over Tokyo, taking off from Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, and we'll continue on into the Philippines and the end of the war itself. John will be joining us on several Pacific tours in the Marianas Islands, Iwo Jima, Japan, as we mentioned before, Guadalcanal. So some great stuff coming your way, both virtually and now that we'll be getting ready to in-person travel again later this year and next year. So thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks everybody.